Buff, I'm glad you raised the issue of paradigm shift and how to look at this whole story through different paradigms, because there's a very important paradigm at work that has left the whole Aboriginal First Nations piece out of the story. And that paradigm is the Western European bias towards written language, and that written language takes precedence over any kind of oral tradition, and in fact is more authoritative. And one of the things that we've discovered as we've been unearthing the history of the introduction of Cree syllabics to a Western audience is that that paradigm was very, very much at work. The Aboriginal people of this part of the world have always known and have always said that the Cree syllabics that they use were a gift from the Creator, and that they were a gift that was given to the Western missionaries when they first came into this part of the world in the late 1800s, in about 1839. And in fact, there's a very famous Canadian missionary by the name of James Evans, who has long been given credit within the Western documentation of syllabics for inventing the Cree syllabics. Well, in fact, when you look at dig deeply into the stories, one of the things that you begin to realize is, yes, the story of James Evans is written down, but in fact the story of James Evans is all based on hearsay. It's an oral tradition that got written down. Now, the reason that it's given more credibility is because James Evans has had several biographers who have claimed that he actually invented the syllabics so that the Cree people in this part of the world could read the Bible in their own tongue and could sing hymns in their own tongue, but they had no written language before he came along. Now, one of the things that we discovered, I was working with Jerry Hutchinson very closely on this. In fact, Jerry did the lion's share of the work. I just took it from him and have done a little more publicizing of it. But one of the things that we discovered is that James Evans himself never claimed to have created the syllabary. The closest he comes that I have found to saying it is that he prepared it. Now, this goes along very nicely with the story of the Cree people, that they gave him the syllabics, and he prepared a publishing system for them, and then was able to distribute them in that form. But in terms of saying that he created them, he never comes close to saying that. That wasn't an issue for him. So one of the questions then becomes, so why did it become such an issue in the Western Canadian and European churches to say that the syllabics had been created by James Evans? Well, one of the things that happens here, we get into a fight between the Canadian church and the Church of England, because James Evans was a Canadian missionary, and he was given the superintendency of the Methodist missions in what was then called the Hudson Bay Company. And he was supervising 3 Church of England missionaries, one of whom was a man by the name of William Mason. Now, Mason and Evans never got along. And in fact, after James Evans was recalled to England for what was called consultations on the mission, he was actually withdrawn from the missions at the request of the Hudson Bay Company by the Church of England. William Mason took over the mission in this part of the world. And James Evans died suddenly in England, and the church that he was part of in Canada, the Canadian Methodists, wanted very much to write his biography, and the Church of England refused to allow any kind of release of information about James Evans that they had. The English Methodists said, we just don't want anything written about James Evans, and we advise you not to write anything about him too. Clearly they had information about what James Evans had been doing in the Hudson Bay Company territories that they didn't want released to anybody else. And the story did later come out that he'd been charged with different kinds of sexual misconduct He'd been charged with interfering in the trade of the Hudson Bay Company, encouraging free trade, had also been encouraging, it looks like, the Cree people to start settling the land, because Evans knew that there were going to be settlers coming from eastern Canada, and his experience had shown that if there were people already settled on the land, they would have a claim to it. And these were the reasons why he was very quickly taken out of the territory, never to return. Now, his colleague, William Mason, stayed, and in 1856, 1857, thereabouts, the first Cree Bible is published in England, and it has William Mason's name on it alone. And this infuriates the Canadian Methodists, who in their history have always maintained that James Evans created the syllabary, not William Mason. And in fact, Ephraim Evans, James's brother, had correspondence from James about the creation of the syllabary. And again, James Evans never said, I designed this, I invented this. All he ever said was, I prepared it. So Ephraim Evans, James's brother, then mounts a campaign to have a biography written about James Evans that says he is the creator, the inventor of the Cree syllabics. Now, the understanding that the Cree gave it to Evans, I don't think ever entered into the picture. It was just not part of the paradigm that there were literate Aboriginal people in this part of the world. It had to be invented by a Westerner, and the choice was between James Evans, the Canadian, William Mason, the English-speaking Wesleyan Methodist missionary, and the Canadians sided wholeheartedly on the side of James Evans being the creator of the Cree syllabary. And that's really where the story has resided ever since. And the Cree claims that they gave it to James Evans has just been completely dismissed because it's an oral tradition, not a written tradition.
Thank you, Geoff. And let's hope we hear this more often, and people watch a play you wrote, actually, that deals with this subject of the authenticity of and the origins of Cree syllabics. It's not the central point of the play altogether, but it comes in as part of it.
Yes, well, it's a play that I wrote on the research that I did called Cloven Hoof. I wrote it actually as part of my doctoral dissertation way back in 1999, and like many dissertations, it sat on the shelf for a while, but it was produced at the Edmonton International Fringe Festival in 2013, and it deals with the conversations that James Evans would have had with his English superiors, whom he had never met. They had placed him in the Hudson Bay Company territory without ever having met him before. And so there are all these stories circulating about what he really did there, because the Hudson Bay Company was so determined that he be taken out of their territory, never to return. That's one part of the story that has been very, very poorly documented. And so it was just wide open for speculation about what kind of conversations might have been held there. One of the very fascinating parts of the story, too, that I did raise in the play, is that James Evans goes to England in 1846, taking the syllabary with him. Hasn't been published yet. And he dies almost immediately upon returning to England. He is there in the summer and dies in November 1846. Just about a year later, another Methodist by the name of William Moon publishes a syllabary for the blind. He's been spending, he himself started out as a missionary, went blind as an adult, and then began looking for a writing system that blind people could use, again, to read the Bible. Within 2 years, he has his system of a syllabary for the blind published. And one of the missionaries who was with James Evans in the Hudson Bay Company territory sees this and says, the last time I saw this, it was bound in moose hide in the territories. And so he writes to William Moon and says, where did you get your system from? And William Moon says it comes as an answer to prayer. Now, it seems pretty clear that there is a direct link between the Cree people of this part of the world in what is now Western Canada, giving the syllabary to James Evans taking it to London, the Wesleyan Methodist Society, who were Evans' supervisors, giving it to William Moon as a system that could be used for people who are blind to read the Bible. William Moon then publishing it as his own system. And this actually predates Braille. This was the very first writing system. And it was so popular that it went right around the world. People all over the world were reading the Bible in the Moon system. And what a story that would be if we were to say that instead of James Evans or William Mason inventing a language for people who couldn't figure it out for themselves, if we were to tell the story about how the Cree gave the syllabary to Evans, to the missionaries, as a gift, and that gift then went right around the world to help all kinds of people who couldn't read because they were blind, read in their own language. I mean, that is a story that has never been told.
Absolutely, and it's directly part of the continuum of healing that these syllabic symbols are associated with, according to the Cree oral tradition. A medicine priest, because he was part of the Mteoak priesthood, had been in a healing lodge, a medicine lodge, and he went into a trance, and it's written up that he died in this trance, and he went into the heavens, and he came back, with a fully reformed syllabary and we should now explain, actually, for the viewers who are not at all familiar with what we're talking about when we use the term a syllabic symbol or the syllabary, system. These are symbols that represent both a consonant and a vowel together in one shape. So this right angle is ma in Cree. Is the shape, whether it's like that, that it's a just like this is cha, whichever position it's in, they're putting 4 positions to denote what the vowel should sound like that follows from the consonant. So that's the syllabic system we're talking about. It goes back so far in history, in physical, tangible, hardcore evidence, that it is amazing anybody would be holding the security blanket of a paradigm as tightly as they do, saying that it came from European missionaries, inventiveness. The Penn treaties and Penn land agreements are all signed by the Delaware, Lenape people in these syllabic symbols. And this is in the early 1700s and late 1600s. Now, we're taught that it was in the 1830s when Evans is supposed to have invented the system. And on that point, invented, what is it he invented? He invented the font with which to print and publish,
system.
With these symbols. He didn't invent the symbols, he invented the font that bears the symbols, that holds the print type. That, I don't know if you went through this in grammar school, but we had to pretend we were all printers, and we had to put little E's and I's and, different things to stamp our name on paper and so on, just for the heck of it. I don't know why we actually went through it. I guess we should have started with bark then, if we were going to go to the origin of writing.
But they just invented the press at the time.
Yeah, the lead and tin, font that had those shapes on there on each piece's tip that you put together, and then you can publish a Bible or a hymnal or whatever else that, from a missionary perspective, you might want to use to, proliferate. Yeah. It's important to keep the continuum in mind that within this lodge called the Mteogamic, these symbols were used for healing, and they were like put on poultices. And when the symbol dissolved on the poultice, it meant that it had run its use. The medicinal value, the spiritual medicinal value of these Cree syllabic characters, the shapes themselves, is best manifested in the doctoring lodges, the medicine and healing spirit lodges, where, especially in the old days when the Mteogamic, the Mede Lodge, was being practiced, the ceremonialist would take the symbol and paint it on a let's say a poultice, if there was a surface wound of some kind on a person who was there for doctoring, and have the first initial of the healing song. So the first initial, meaning the first sound in the healing song, the first sound of the Cree word in a healing song is what would be the symbol on that would be used I'm using a poultice as an example. They were used in all kinds of other ways, but and with a poultice, the symbol would slowly dissolve, because poultices are wet, and so by the time it had dissolved, would be an indicator to the ceremonialist that the healing process has occurred. So that goes with using that syllabic system for the blind. I mean, it's interesting that it comes right out of the medicine lodge and into the world. So people deprived of an ability to read suddenly have it. So it cured, thousands of blind people in the sense that they now could read, and they couldn't before. And that goes straight with the indigenous, traditional use and value of those symbols.
Yes.
And that's true straight across the board. The high priesthood in Egypt used the hieroglyphs, in similar ways. Anywhere the Magi with their writing systems used them in very similar ways. And so why wouldn't the Cree do the same? And why wouldn't it be as old as any other writing form, given the way that writing forms developed, usually phonetically? The Mayan hieroglyph system, look at that. That's phonetic. It's grammatical. It's all varieties of systems of writing, kind of thrown into one expression. The whole area now, going back to the money pit at Oak Island, the whole realm of thought that concerns the origin of the money pit, who used it, what was put in it, how did they access it, how did they develop those strange booby traps of flood tunnels and things like that. In going through all of the various theories, there's something that's really missing in the picture. And what's really missing has to do with what I think is the most dominant and compelling theory about the more recent use of the pit. Not to suggest that it didn't have an earlier use, but the more recent use from the 1600s on has to do with the fact that a man named William Phipps, a shipbuilder out of Boston, in 1687, after having found the shipwreck of the Concepcion on a coral reef south of the Bahamas, west of the Bahamas, southwest of the Bahamas, after having found the Concepcion on a coral reef that was loaded with treasure, silver, gold, jewels, all kinds of Chinese porcelain, all kinds of valuables were on this ship. Phipps took the silver off of it, and he brought the silver to England, and he presented all that silver to King James II in 1687. 1687. 1688, William of Orange gives King James the boot and takes the throne. So we now have a new king King James is removed, had to go into exile, but because he was a beloved king, and not only Catholics but Presbyterians, all the Celtic people, you know, all the Quakers were with him. The Jews of Britain supported King James II. You know, he had a big following when he got the boot. Ultimately, because of the Church of England, he had expressed the desire that the Church of England embrace all of these minorities, the Presbyterians in particular, the Quakers, the Jews, and the Catholics, and that was his downfall, because the Church of England was very worried, and the growing Protestant movement, that the King James was going to really go back into the fold and embrace of Rome. So he got the boot. Just before he got the boot, he got all the silver. And he knighted William Phipps for having brought the silver from the Concepcion to England. Phipps left the gold behind because the ship, the treasure ship, had run onto the bank, but the rear half of it was not on any solid foundation, only the front half. So with the movement of the water and so on, the rear half of the ship broke off. That's where all the gold was, and it found its own nest. Mm-hmm. And they finally found where the gold was in the remainder of the ship that had kind of moved away from the part that was on the coral reef. So that, as the theory goes, and I suspect it's a theory that it was, you know, in large part generated by you know, the more Protestant thinking people who believed in the Glorious Revolution of William of Orange, that then became Mary's, you know, throne, that then became King George I, II, and III, who the Americans fought against, and, you know, all of that. That the fixing on this paradigm of the Glorious Revolution, which was kicking King James off the throne, and saying that Phipps now was hiding the gold to give to the new king, I find just impossible, almost. For several reasons. We've already touched on one of them, which is that, you know, the entire indigenous community of the region was pro-France and pro-Catholic. And they would have seen as enemies the English, and they would have certainly seen the Iroquoian Confederacy also as allies, you know, of the English, and equally as enemies. It would have been very difficult to be getting to the gold, remaining gold, amidst, and it would have taken a long time to do it, amidst indigenous people who would have been passing by, watching this and knowing that these were the English serving a new lord who wasn't going to help them. And they certainly would have been fully informed of that by the French. It doesn't make any sense. It makes more sense to think that who now is Sir William Phipps, because King James in 1687 had knighted him for the silver, that Sir Phipps had stored the gold for the Jacobite movement, for the movement to restore King James II to the throne, or his heir, and therefore keep the house of Stuart, you know, as the monarchy, and not this new Hanoverian bunch of people who weren't even really British, except for Mary, who married William of Orange, who himself was not of the family. So, and out of them came the King's George. So there are two issues here. One, how everybody has just settled on this notion that the Glorious Revolution is what was at work in hiding the gold to bring to the new King William of Orange, when King James was the person who had knighted the very man who, in the theory, is said to be hiding the gold after he delivered the silver to King James II. So it doesn't make to me, personally, it makes no sense. I'm something of a Jacobite expert, you know, I'm on record as such and identified as such. I've been through all the Jacobite archives of France and of Scotland. And, you know, I have a pretty good handle on the movement and who participated in it and where they all went when they were arrested. And, you know, at the time of the Jacobite rebellion, there were a lot of people, aristocratic people, who weren't sure about the success of William of Orange. They weren't altogether comfortable about throwing all their eggs into his basket. Many of them, you know, were on the fence, and they went whichever way they thought would be to their advantage. So there's a famous family, the Anson family, some of whom were Jacobites and were arrested in the 1715 first initially important uprising, and amongst the 1,569 who were arrested and exiled to New England, some of those Ansons were named. Now, other members of that same family that owned the Shugborough Hall, Litchfield estate, used to watch the Jacobites march across their land, but later became, you know, very Protestant-oriented Freemasons, and you would never have thought that they had anything to do with any kind of Jacobite support, when their own family members were exiled as Jacobite rebels, and they themselves, the two brothers who owned the estate, watched the Jacobite armies march across their land on their way to London. So I think that there's some degree of negligence in terms of real research on the part of those teams, and I'm referring to both of them now. The team that was working, you know, from 2000 to, let's say, 2006, and then the team that replaced that original team that's still at work with the new owners, the Lagina brothers or Lagina brothers, out of Michigan. I believe they're from Michigan. Mm-hmm. So. Oddly, ultimately, these two Americans who bought Oak Island, you know, are living in a republic that, in effect, when George Washington became president, had almost gone into a monarchy, but a monarchy led by the heir apparent to King James. George Washington sent 4 officials to Rome, to Bonnie Prince Charles Edward Stuart's son, to ask him if he would like to come to America to be president. And I can read you, in fact, very, very briefly, the fascinating account of this. It's under a title called the Crown of America. And so this is a paragraph, I'll read it quickly. In establishing their republic, the Americans could still not escape the ideal of a parallel monarchy, a central focus of non-political patriotic attachment. George Washington was actually offered kingship, but declined because he had no immediately qualifying heritage. Instead, he turned to the royal house of Stuart. In November 1782, 4 Americans arrived at the Palazzo San Clemente in Florence, the residence of Charles III Stuart, in exile. They were McGalloway of Maryland, 2 brothers named Sylvester from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fish, a lawyer from New York. They were taken to Charles Edward by his secretary John Stuart. Also present was the Honorable Charles Hervey Townshend, later Britain's ambassador to The Hague, and the prince's future wife, Marguerite, Countess de Massillon. The interview, which revolved around the contemporary transatlantic dilemma, is documented in the U.S. Senate archives and in the Manawater papers. Writers such as Sir Compton Mackenzie and Sir Charles Petrie have also described the occasion when Charles Edward Stuart was invited to become king of the Americans. So that then brings up the issue, given that George Washington wanted a king, And later FDR, both of whom were Freemasons, FDR becomes intensely preoccupied by Oak Island, visits there 3 times. My position on that is that there was a continuum, and it is a Masonic continuum. 1 out of 3 American presidents have been Masons, that shared knowledge about Oak Island, its history, and what was thought to be buried there. Now, the real question arises, then who is it who should be inheriting the gold, if it's still there? But remind me, if I forget, to bring up the very bizarre arrival of a huge amount of gold in 1746, after the Battle of Culloden. But I want to read you what one of the main researchers, one of the main contributors to the Oak Island investigation, he's a professional engineer, is deeply involved, was anyway, in the free circle development in engineering and its use for diamond mining in northern Alberta. And he's still used and admired very much by the present team of investigators of the Oak Island mystery. Here's how he concludes his 3rd edition to this. It's interesting, I've got all of his editions, how he evolves his salutations to me from the beginning to the end. If we have time, we'll get to that. Okay. Here's his closing. To whom does the treasure belong? This is a hypothetical question at the present time, but could be of importance if it is ever recovered. See, right now, the treasure hunters think that they get, that it's theirs, without consultation with anybody who is an expert on international law. This is a provincial determination out of Nova Scotia that they're operating on. Maybe, by a stretch, a federal assumption, or an assumption about federal guarantees that they get to keep X percentage of whatever booty is hauled out of the pit. But international law sometimes prevails over national and provincial or state-based law. And so consider this. I'm going to start it again. To whom does this treasure belong? This is a hypothetical question at the present time. It could be of importance if it is ever recovered. The recovery of any large quantity of treasure is likely to spur claims by third parties. And the greater the treasure, the deeper the litigious quagmire. It may be argued that since the lost treasure of Oak Island was originally deposited by Phipps on behalf of William, Prince of Orange, subsequently King William III, and since Queen Elizabeth is the latest monarch in an unbroken line following William's accession, the treasure belongs to the crown. Well, wait a minute. What did you hear what I just said? Did you get the leap of logic and reasoning that he's made? He's saying it may be argued that since the lost treasure of Oak Island was originally deposited by Phipps on behalf of William, Prince of Orange, there's no evidence anywhere that it was deposited there for the new king. There's plenty of compelling argument that it was put there to finance the Jacobite rebellion to get the House of Stuart back into the throne and bring peace between France and England, if nothing else. So this is the Glorious Revolution syndrome, I call it. First of all, I don't even believe in Reformation, counter-Reformation history. I think it's all a bunch of hype, and it helps to reinforce divisions and all the rest of it. So I'm not a good person to debate, Protestant versus Catholic issues to begin with. That said, if it is true that Phipps put gold in the money pit for the reinstatement of the House of Stuart, then that means that the heir apparent living today is Princess Sophia of Liechtenstein, not this Queen Elizabeth or any of her offspring, which is kind of interesting, that kind of stirs the pot a little bit. And given that these are Americans who purchased Oak Island, And that they're living in a nation that is what it is because of the final victory of the Jacobite rebellion, which is called the American Revolution. How do they fall out then on something like, you know, the determination of who gets this booty? So this could become a huge international scandal. I mean, if they ever do the phrase ring and get down to the bottom. And, you know, I am in touch with a couple of sheikhs who might well consider financing the freeze ring if they are assured something in this picture. And I've got all kinds of documents here. I had to read one aloud when I made the formal presentation of part of the cofferdam when I was in Manama, Bahrain, to Sheikh Dwayj Al Khalifa. From the group that's presently doing the work and their consultant from the last team, Les McPhee. I mean, if these are billionaires, these sheikhs, and they can afford to do a freeze ring for 30 million or whatever it might cost. If in the end they actually thought they were going to get the Ark of the Covenant or whatever else it might be. I have a bit of a downside conclusion to all of this because of something that happened after the Battle of Culloden, which was the last great Jacobite uprising.